And we're tackling a really significant development in the Ukraine conflict. These recent Ukrainian attacks reaching way inside Russian territory. Specifically, we're zeroing in on a major drone strike um, targeting airbases that apparently just happened.
Exactly. Our mission here is to sift through these sources, pull out the key details of these attacks, try to understand their immediate context, and really explore what this pattern of strikes might signify for the war itself.
And right off the bat, one thing from these sources just leaps out: the sheer distance involved. We're talking attacks thousands of kilometers behind the front lines, hitting some pretty crucial Russian military assets.
Yeah, it's not just incremental progress we're seeing described here. Based on the sources, it feels more like a strategic leap.
Okay, so let's unpack this specific event the sources highlight. This major Ukrainian drone operation that took place on Sunday, June 2nd. What exactly did your sources say went down?
Well, this was apparently a large-scale operation, hitting multiple military air bases deep inside Russia. Al Jazeera reports Ukraine claimed they used a pretty staggering 117 drones.
117. Wow.
Yeah. And CBS puts the number slightly differently, saying over 100 FPV, first-person view drones were deployed.
Over 100 drones targeting Russian air bases deep inside. That's massive. And where were these bases located?
The sources list airfields across 5 different regions: Murmansk, Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur. That's according to Al Jazeera. CBS also mentions 5 air bases spread out across the country.
What's truly astonishing here, though, is the geography. These weren't just close to the border. Al Jazeera points out the Belaya Air Base in Irkutsk is roughly 4,300 kilometers from the Ukrainian border.
4,300 kilometers.
Yeah, and Alenia Air Base in Murmansk, that's some 1,800 kilometers away. CBS notes the furthest base was more than 3,700 meters away, which, looking at Al Jazeera's numbers, surely must mean kilometers, right? Reaching deep into Russia's far east.
It seems like a typo. Yeah, kilometers makes much more sense given the context. Hitting targets over 4,000 kilometers away with drones,
Yep.
that really changes the conversation.
Absolutely. That kind of range, especially with FPV drones, which, are usually thought of as shorter range. How do they even manage that, according to the sources? This
Yeah.
is where the method is key, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And CBS gives us a really fascinating detail here. It differs a bit from Al Jazeera's broader statement about launching near the airfields. CBS reports these FPV drones were actually hidden inside the roofs of containers.
Inside containers?
Yeah, containers that were apparently smuggled into the country. And the roofs could be opened remotely, just mere miles from each target base.
Wait, hang on. So the CBS account suggests they weren't launched from Ukraine, but were actually smuggled close to the targets inside Russia and then activated? That's a completely different operational picture.
That seems to be the implication for the CBS source, yeah. It sort of bypasses the whole challenge of extreme range from Ukrainian territory.
Yeah.
They also mentioned Ukraine claiming the actual planning office for this incredibly complex operation was located inside Russia.
Inside Russia.
Get this, right next to a regional headquarters of Russia's FSB security service.
Wow. Okay, if that's true, that adds an incredible layer of operational audacity. All right, so we have the targets, the scale, the method. What did Ukraine claim was the result? What was the reported impact?
Well, Ukrainian sources are claiming very significant damage. President Zelensky was quoted by Al Jazeera saying Russia suffered very tangible losses. And the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, they went even further, claiming they hit Russian military planes with a combined value of $7 billion.
$7 billion.
Yeah.
That's a colossal figure. Did the sources specify which aircraft were targeted to rack up that kind of price tag?
Ukrainian media reports, which Al Jazeera cited, claimed at least 41 Russian heavy bombers were hit, specifically 295 and 222 strategic bombers. And this was apparently across 4 of the air bases. CBS adds that Ukraine claimed this attack took out more than a third of Russia's long-range strategic bombers.
A third. So Ukraine is claiming hits on major strategic assets and a significant chunk of Russia's long-range bomber fleet. How did Russia respond to these claims? What did their defense ministry say?
Right, so Russia's defense ministry reported that their air defenses managed to repel the assaults everywhere, except in Murmansk and Irkutsk. They did acknowledge that aircraft caught fire in those 2 locations.
Okay, so they confirmed some impact.
Yes, but they stated that fires were quickly extinguished, and importantly stressed that no casualties were reported at the bases. Al Jazeera also notes that Russia reported detaining some individuals they say were involved in the attacks.
So the sources give us this really stark contrast. Ukraine claims 41 bombers hit, $7 billion in damage, maybe a third of the long-range fleet. versus Russia confirming fires on aircraft at just 2 bases, quickly put out, no base casualties. That's quite a gap in the reporting.
It is a significant gap, and it's important, to note that the sources present both sets of claims. However, Al Jazeera's initial assessment suggests that even if you account for potential overstatement, if any significant number of strategic bombers were damaged thousands of kilometers inside Russia, well, this attack could still mark Ukraine's most damaging single drone strike of the entire war so far.
Okay. So this attack on the air bases happened on Sunday. What else was going on around that time? What's the immediate context the sources provide for us?
What's particularly notable about the timing, according to both Al Jazeera and CBS, is that this major strike happened just the day before peace talks were scheduled in Istanbul.
Ah, right. Between Ukrainian and Russian officials.
Exactly. And these were the talks spurred by former U.S. President Trump. Correct.
Yes. Al Jazeera mentions his involvement in getting those talks going. The sources report the talks did lead to an agreement on a prisoner swap, which is something.
Definitely significant, yeah. But crucially, there was no major breakthrough towards a ceasefire. Al Jazeera notes Zelensky's stated priorities for the talks included a complete ceasefire and the return of prisoners and abducted children, while Russia, indicated it had its own specific terms.
So a massive strike, literally on the eve of high-profile talks. That timing, it seems highly intentional, doesn't it? Maybe designed to influence the negotiations or just demonstrate capability.
That's certainly one interpretation the timing invites, yeah. It also fits into a broader pattern. The sources describe this increasing intensity in cross-border strikes recently. Al Jazeera points out that in the week before this airbase attack, Russia had launched over 900 kamikaze drones and 92 missiles into Ukraine, tragically killing at least 16 civilians.
Right.
And Ukraine itself had used at least 800 drones in attacks on Russian military infrastructure, places like Tula, Alabuga, Tatarstan, in the days immediately preceding this big airbase strike.
So the tempo of these deep strikes was already incredibly high from both sides. Were there any other notable events happening around that same weekend, according to the sources?
Yes, actually. Both Al Jazeera and CBS reported that bridges collapsed in 2 different Russian regions bordering Ukraine over that same weekend. This resulted in 7 or 8 fatalities and apparently 89 injuries. CBS notes that Moscow is treating these incidents as possible acts of terrorism.
But Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility.
No, Ukraine hasn't claimed responsibility for those bridge collapses. CBS also mentioned that concurrent with the airbase attack weekend, Russia launched additional ballistic missiles and drones into Ukraine's northeast, injuring at least 6 people there.
And the sources also mentioned comments from former U.S. President Trump around this time regarding the conflict and Russian President Putin.
Yeah. Al Jazeera highlights some public frustration Trump expressed in late May. He was talking about the lack of progress and specifically commented on Putin. He's quoted saying things like, something has happened to him and he has gone absolutely crazy. Why?
Strong words.
Yeah. Trump also reportedly expressed some bewilderment, saying, we're in the middle of talking and he's shooting rockets into Kyiv and other cities.
Why?
Al Jazeera did note that at the time of their report, Trump hadn't yet publicly reacted to the Sunday Ukrainian airbase attacks themselves.
Okay. This June 2nd airbase attack is certainly dramatic because of its scale and reach, but the sources make it pretty clear this isn't, entirely out of the blue. Al Jazeera frames this as just the latest in a series of what it calls audacious strikes by Ukraine since the full-scale invasion began back in February 2022. Let's maybe zoom out a bit and look at that pattern the sources describe. What were some of the most significant examples they review?
Right, if we step back and look at the bigger picture the sources paint, these kinds of deep strikes have been a feature for a while now. The attacks on the Crimea Bridge are probably a prime example.
Ah, yes, the hugely symbolic bridge connecting Russia to the annexed peninsula, the one Putin himself drove across to open.
That's the one. Al Jazeera reminds us it was first hit by a truck explosion back in October 2022. Russia blamed Ukraine for that one, and they repaired it. Then, in July 2023, it was hit again, this time described by Russia's own anti-terrorism committee as a sea drone attack.
Sea drones.
Yeah. And that second strike on the bridge, which is, a critical military and civilian supply route, tragically killed 2 people and wounded a child.
So hitting vital infrastructure and a really powerful symbol. What other major attacks deep behind the lines does Al Jazeera highlight for us?
They detail some significant attacks on Russia's Black Sea Fleet in September 2023. These targeted facilities in occupied Crimea near Sevastopol. Satellite imagery reportedly showed one strike destroying half of the communications command center in a place called Verknosadov. There was also a strike on the Saki airfield, which apparently hosted about 12 Russian combat aircraft at the time.
And the big one, the one on the fleet headquarters itself.
Yes, Al Jazeera describes the strike on the Black Sea Fleet Command headquarters on September 22nd as, well, the most devastating attack on the fleet mentioned in their sources. Ukraine claimed to have killed 34 officers in that single strike, including the fleet commander himself, Admiral Viktor Sokolov, and wounded 105 soldiers. Russia's reporting on casualties from that incident was significantly different, it should be noted.
So hits on logistics, communications, airfields, naval command, and then maybe the most symbolic target of all, the Kremlin itself.
The sources do cover that incident in May 2023, yeah, where 2 Ukrainian drones attacked the Kremlin in Moscow. Russia immediately called it a planned terrorist act and an attempt on President Putin's life.
But Ukraine denied it.
President Zelensky publicly denied it, yes. He stated Ukraine doesn't attack Putin or Moscow and fights only on its own territory. However, Al Jazeera does note that independent analysts generally believe Ukrainian special forces were indeed behind that particular attack.
Hitting the very heart of Russian power. Wow. Okay, so beyond these strikes on infrastructure and military facilities, the sources also mention actual ground incursions into Russian territory.
They do. Al Jazeera details that surprise attack into the Kursk region back in August 2024. This incursion was significant enough that it led to Russia evacuating parts of the neighboring Belgorod region. Ukraine initially claimed control of nearly 1,400 square kilometers during that push.
1,400 square kilometers inside Russia.
That was the claim, yeah. Russia eventually recaptured most of that territory by early 2025. Al Jazeera notes Ukraine launched a second wave of incursions in January 2025, but sources indicate they suffered a setback then, after U.S. military aid was temporarily cut off. Russia reportedly regained most of that territory by early March.
Okay, so this is quite a portfolio of deep strikes and actions we're seeing described. Symbolic bridges, naval command, airfields, the Kremlin, ground incursions, and now strategic bombers thousands of kilometers away, using seemingly very innovative methods like these smuggled drones. If we connect all these dots, what does this pattern revealed in the sources really tell us? Why does it matter?
Well, what really stands out is how these attacks demonstrate not just an evolution in Ukraine's capabilities, especially in long-range drone tech and potentially covert operations like that smuggling method CBS describes, but also a clear strategic decision and a willingness to take the fight far beyond the immediate front lines, directly targeting Russia's homeland and its high-value military assets.
So it's about degrading Russia's ability to project military power, hitting those strategic bombers, naval assets, command centers. Is that the main goal?
That seems to be a major part of it, yes. It aims to directly impact Russia's ability to wage war by targeting crucial elements like their long-range strike capability, the bombers' logistical support, like the Crimea Bridge, command and control, like the Black Sea Fleet HQ, and maybe also attempting to force Russia to divert resources to homeland defense, pulling them away from the front. Plus, the symbolic hits like the Kremlin or the Crimea Bridge, they carry significant psychological and political weight too.
Yet placing this in the broader context of the ongoing war, how does it fit?
Well, these aren't just random acts, as the sources suggest. They seem to be part of the escalating dynamics we've seen. They could serve multiple potential purposes: pressuring Russia, disrupting their operations, showcasing Ukraine's own resilience and ingenuity, and maybe even trying to influence the strategic calculus ahead of, or maybe even doing, diplomatic engagements like those Istanbul talks.
And for you, the listener, why is understanding this specific pattern of deep strikes so important right now? What's the takeaway?
Because it fundamentally changes the picture of the conflict, doesn't it? It's not just about lines on a map shifting back and forth near the border regions anymore. It highlights how the war is being fought technologically and strategically, reaching into areas that were previously assumed to be, well, safe. The methods described, like that potential drone smuggling operation for the airbase strikes, show really creative ways to potentially bypass established defenses. So understanding these deep strikes is pretty crucial, I think, to grasping the full scope of this war and the evolving nature of modern conflict itself, where strategic depth seems to be shrinking.
Yeah, it really feels like it redefines the whole idea of what a front line even is in this war.
Precisely. That's a good way to put it.
So, to wrap up, the sources we've explored reveal this clear pattern of increasingly audacious Ukrainian strikes reaching deep into Russia, culminating, for now, in that widespread, high-impact drone attack on strategic air bases, demonstrating a significant capability